Hi, my name is Nick Tomaszewski, Product Development Manager here at Ebony International. I'm here today to talk to you about Coors 101. We've had some really cool and really exciting announcements here that have been made with the Alias and some other pieces that we've got coming up, and we want to really start to educate you guys with what we mean by certain RG parameters or diffs and how do you modify them with weight holes and some thumb hole placements and some other things. And so what we're going to go into is we're going to dive into what is Coors 101, and we're going to start by defining what the definition of a symmetrical core is versus an asymmetrical core. And I can tell you that every one of your guys' arsenals does not have a completely symmetrical bowling ball in the bag. We'll go down that whole path on what happens to the bowling ball after you put a hole in it. You know, once you put your fingers in that bowling ball, you're modifying that core in such a way that you've really got to see what's going down the lane when you're throwing it, not necessarily what we manufacture. And so to jump into it, you can see I've got two cores here. One is a symmetrical, which is on the left side. You've got the enhanced V2, which you're going to see in our Game Breaker 2s and in our Game Breaker 3s. And then you're going to see the Paradox iCore 2.0 here. You've got two very distinguishable cores. The left is obviously symmetrical, and on the right is asymmetrical. And we're going to go down the path on what that means and what RG contours and what those things look like. And so out of our manufacturing process, the bowling ball that you see on the screen is what we would design, what we would manufacture, and what we would ultimately ship to you or a pro shop. Well, when you actually have that bowling ball and we design it, you can see that it is completely symmetrical. What that means is this red band around the center of that ball shows that it's completely symmetrical. That's the RG contours, and what RGs are, they're basically radius of gyrations, and on the next couple slides I'll explain to you what those mean. But right now, out of our factory, we're going to actually manufacture this product to be completely symmetrical. There's no difference between this side of the red band versus this side. It's completely symmetrical all the way around the bowling ball. And so what we're going to look at is when we start designing these things, what are RGs? What is the radius of gyration? Well, it's really simple. Think of it like an ice skater spinning in circles. Well, if they've got their hands out, they're spinning really slowly, but then they tuck their hands in, they spin a lot faster. What they're doing is ultimately changing their radius of gyration, or their RG. So when, in our design process, we'll design a core that has a certain type of low RG. So like for the Game Breaker, for instance, that you can see, the advertised low RG is up at the top of the screen at 2.48 inches. And so what that means is, when we manufacture this process, or this bowling ball, the low RG along the pin, every bowling ball has a little dot. Well, that's the top of the core. That RG, or radius of gyration along that axis, is what we publish. That's the low RG. And so for this core has a 2.48 inch of an RG. Well, how do you find the differential? That's the other thing that we publish. You always see the RGs, the differentials, and for an asymmetrical ball, you're going to see something called mass bias. But because this is symmetrical, there is no mass bias because you saw that red band go all the way around the ball. So it's symmetrical. Well, how do we get the differential? Well, differential is actually created by the difference between the low RG, which we advertise, and the high RG, which is typically 90 degrees from the center of the ball. You can see here on this y-axis versus the x-axis. So how do we get those measurements internally? Well, we'll actually take the bowling ball and we'll sit it on this, what's called a swing. And we're basically going to let that swing go, and because of gravity pulling that bowling ball down, it causes it to rotate. And so as that thing oscillates, that bowling ball oscillates around, we're going to take a time measurement on how long it takes to oscillate a certain amount of times. Let's say we're measuring 10 passes or 10 oscillations. Well, let's say it took 4 minutes for the low RG, because you know the low RG is tight, it's going to spin faster. Well, let's say instead of 4 minutes, it took 4.5 minutes once we turned the bowling ball and swung it on the high RG axis, because now it's swinging slower. It took 4.5 minutes versus 4 minutes. So we're going to measure the difference in that time, and that ultimately gives us the difference between the low RG and the high RG, which in turn gives you what is differential. And so you could see for this Game Breaker core here, the low RG is 2.48 inches, and the high RG, which is the y-axis, is 2.528 inches. Well, doing some very simple math, we subtracted the high versus the low, and we got a difference of 0.48. So that is how you get a differential. So that's what we publish, what we design and manufacture, and we publish on every single one of our ad sheets. So now that you know what it is as far as what we've manufactured, what happens when you put a hole in the bowling ball? You don't throw a completely pure, non-drilled bowling ball. You have to put holes in it. That's what USBC says that we have to do to make it legal for a gripping parameter. So once you put holes in that bowling ball, you're modifying the core in such a way that you're no longer at those manufactured specs. So I'm going to explain to you what happens. You can see on the left, those complete RG bands are completely symmetrical. That red band is what's manufactured. This number down here, we talked a lot about the differential, but now we're going to talk about the intermediate. Because if it's symmetrical out of our plant, it has no intermediate or mass bias. Intermediate, mass bias, those terms are the exact same thing. And so what happens is, before you drill the bowling ball, it is completely symmetrical. So yeah, you might go in and you might buy a symmetrical bowling ball, but the second you put holes in it, notice that red band of the RG contours. Notice it goes from a completely symmetrical band here on the left to now becoming more of an I shape. Well, that I shape is because you now have an intermediate. Notice this number here goes all the way up to 0.11. That actually is pretty strong intermediate core. That's almost like an upper mid or an HP core that we would design out of our factory. And so using Blueprint, and Blueprint's a software that we use in office here, and you guys can actually purchase it. It's a simulation tool where you can see where these holes and what you're doing to the cores, and you can see what the before and the after numbers are as you're building your arsenal. So it's really important to use something like Blueprint because there's no other opportunity to do that in the real world. And so what you could see is that you've now drilled this bowling ball, and this is what you would throw going down the lane. That's what we would bowl with. It's no longer symmetrical. You've actually got the intermediate of 0.11. So when you're throwing that bowling ball, it's technically rolling like an asymmetrical bowling ball because you've modified it with holes. Also using Blueprint, you can see where you're exactly hitting the core and what parts of the cores you're taking out, what parts you're manipulating to change. And that's what's really cool about Blueprint is you can see what you're actually throwing and what's going down the lane. So you've seen really what happens to a symmetrical ball once you put 3 holes in it and you're gripping holes. But what happens if you put a weight hole in it? What if you wanted to try to make it symmetrical? Can you do that? Physically, yes, you can. You can take your ball that we just saw, we had it drilled, pin is above the fingers, that blue marking is the CG, it's straight in line with your grip. Well, we can actually put a weight hole 6 3/4 inches over from the pin, 90 degrees to the thumb. So basically, you're almost taking the core that you've taken out with your thumb, you're basically trying to add it back in by taking the weight hole out. So what happens to the core numbers? Well, you can see the red band goes back from an I focused around the thumb, which is the mass bias, now is completely symmetrical again. So yes, you can put a weight hole in it, and you can get it back to almost completely symmetrical. The problem you run into is by doing that at 6 3/4 over, you no longer are throwing a bowling ball that has a hole in a flare-safe zone. Your ball, by simulating this in Blueprint, you can see where your bowler is going to track over those holes. Well, bowler doesn't want that. The bowler is going to come back in and he's going to want that hole plugged, and that bowling ball is now not going to go down the lane completely symmetrical because it's going to either thump going down the lane and make thump, 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 thump going down the lane, or you're going to have to plug it, which makes it back to symmetrical again. So ultimately, you still don't have a throwable product that's completely symmetrical in your bag. So now you know a little bit about symmetrical. We're going to jump into what is an asymmetrical bowling ball. Well, we're going to do the same thing we talked about before. What is an asymmetrical bowling ball? Well, out of our factory, our manufactured process, it has a distinguishable eye. That is that eye that you see here in the center RG contour image. And you can see that that's not a band all the way around the bowling ball. That is an eye that's focused around the mass bias of the ball. Well, that mass bias just shows you that inside that bowling ball is a core that is not symmetrical all the way around the ball. You can see that with this Paradox I-Core 2.0. You've got different densities. You've got the blue, which is ultimately the more dense pancake, or if you want to call it a bow tie, you can call it that. And you've also got the green material showing on by Blueprint there. That's a lighter density material. So you can see what types of material and where you're going to drill that bowling ball just by using Blueprint. And so what we're going to do is talk again about how do we get those RG contours and how do we get those differentials, and ultimately how do you get the mass bias, which is now on the z-axis. So I've got the I-Core 2.0 right here. So again, I'm going to explain. What we do is we'll take the bowling ball, and imagine the bowling ball's there, and you've got this core located right in the center of that bowling ball. We're going to put it on the swing, and we're going to count how long it takes for that core to oscillate, let's say 10 times. Well, again, let's say it takes 4 minutes to do that. Well, then we're actually going to take this core and we're going to flip it this way. And we're going to swing it again and see how long it takes to get to 10 oscillations. Well, again, because this is a higher RG on this side, it's going to take a lot longer. Because think about that ice skater spinning it. She's spinning a lot slower versus a lot faster. So she's changing her RGs, or radius of gyrations. And so by doing that, we can take that on all three of the axes of the bowling ball. This would be pin up, this would be mass bias up, and this would be that new z-axis. So by measuring the differences in the time using algorithms and inertial properties of the entire ball, we can then measure what the low RG is. We can measure what the difference between the low RG and the high RG, which is the y-axis, which gives you the differential of 0.57. We can also measure what the difference between the y and the z is, which gives you the intermediate mass bias or the intermediate differential, which in this case is 0.15. And so by doing that on the swing, we can get all of these things out of our factory and manufacture it in such a way that now we can advertise it that way. But again, what happens when you put a hole in the bowling ball? So every bowler in the world is going to put some sort of finger hole or gripping hole in the bowling ball. They're modifying that core. So just because we manufactured, we advertised, we promoted it this way, always think about what you're doing or what the driller is doing when they're putting holes in the bowling ball. So showing you the same thing that we went through with the symmetrical chord bowling ball, I'm going to show you what we do with an asymmetrical bowling ball. And so you can see that starting out of our factory in the manufactured process, there's that eye that's located around the mass bias of the bowling ball. Well, that mass bias starts out at 0.15 out of our factory. So what happens when we put the thumb hole, for instance, right on top of the mass bias? Let's say we drilled into the mass bias and your thumb went right there. Well, think about what you're doing to the core. You're removing mass from the middle, which makes the outside more dominant. So you're going to actually take that and you're going to make it more asymmetrical. That core is going to get stronger the more hole or the more weight you remove from the center of that thumb hole mass bias area. So like I said, you saw this thumb hole going right into the mass bias. You could see that eye going from more of a band to more of now a circle, because that's the mass bias getting stronger. Notice how the intermediate or mass bias number went up to 0.27. It almost doubled the strength of the core by putting the thumb hole right on the mass bias. Well, the slowly you start taking more and more that mass bias further and further away from the thumb, the weaker you're going to make that core. So remember, we started at 0.15 by putting the thumb hole right on top of the mass bias. That's going to go to 0.27. But all the way to the right here, you can see that we've started kicking this mass bias further away from the thumb. Well, we're going from a 0.27 drilling now down to a 0.22. So think about, you're taking that mass bias, you're pushing it away from the core or from your thumb, you're taking that further and further away, so you're actually reducing the sides of the core. So you're going to start taking more and more of the side of the core out with the thumb. So you're taking some of the asymmetry away. So using Blueprint, you can see that you're tapping into the center of the bow tie there, and then with this layout, you're actually tapping right into the side of the bow tie. So it's really cool to use Blueprint to be able to see what you're affecting and what the before and after numbers are with specific layouts. So it asks you the question again, does anybody have a symmetrical bowling ball in their arsenal? No. But you can almost get to asymmetrical bowling balls in your arsenal with something like this, by doing this crazy layout that you take this mass bias, you kick it 90 degrees to the thumb. You can see the thumb is here, and we've kicked the mass bias all the way out to the side. You can see on both sides that there's a mass bias rod sticking 90 degrees to the thumb. Look at what happened to the symmetrical RG contours of the bowling ball. Those RG contours began to get a band again, which means it's symmetrical. The thing you run into is, well, yeah, you did get it symmetrical, 0.005, but notice the static weights. the static weights become an issue because you've kicked that CG, which is that blue marker, you've kicked it so far away from your center of grip, which would be right in here. You've now kicked it way up here. USB-C says that ball is no longer legal to throw. And so what happens is you have to put a weight hole to balance that out to become statically balanced or USB-C legal. So after you put a weight hole, you see we put a weight hole here, we put it on the bowler's PAP. And notice the static weights are now legal. So that bowling ball is a legal product to throw, which is great. But because you've now modified that core in such a way, the intermediate is no longer symmetrical anymore. It's now an asymmetrical bowling ball. It goes back all the way up to 014. So again, you don't have a symmetrical bowling ball going down the lane because it's almost impossible unless we started doing things like, if you see the Alias, you can see that we've modified our manufacturing specs. You can see that we've started changing the way that we're designing cores in such a way that you can create this. So ultimately, think about really what you're doing to a bowling ball before and after you drill it. Thank you for watching.